Now for our speaker tonight. Ariel Evan Mayse is assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University. Professor Mayse holds a PhD in Jewish Studies from Harvard University and rabbinic ordination from Beit Midrash Harel in Jerusalem. His current research examines the role of language in Hasidism, manuscript theory in the formation of early Hasidic literature, the renaissance of Jewish mysticism in the 19th and 20th century, the relationship between spirituality and law in Jewish legal writings, and the resources of Jewish thought and theology for constructing contemporary environmental ethics. He's the author and editor of many books, including Speaking Infinities, God and Language and the Teachings of Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, which was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020. And I should mention that the Hebrew translation, Dibur Le'Ein Sof, is forthcoming with Bar-Ilan University Press. I hope to see it very soon. He's also the editor of the 2-volume anthology, A New Hasidism Roots and A New Hasidism Branches, co-edited with Arthur Green, which came out in 2019. He's currently completing a manuscript titled The Shores of Devotion, Ritual and the Life of the Commandments in Early Hasidism, and his next project, As a Deep River Rises, Judaism, Ecology, and Environmental Ethics, is under contract with Brandeis University Press. Professor Mayse, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sam, for that very kind introduction. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you. Tafat, one of my oldest friends in academia and fellow traveler. David, one of my academic mentors. David was in his last year of graduate school when I did my first year of graduate school, has been kindly advising me and helping me at every step of the way. So it's just so nice to see you both and Sam, to have this time and to meet all of these new friends. I'm happy to be interrupted if you feel that there's something that really is pertinent and needs to be addressed at a particular point. Otherwise, there's plenty of time at the end for us to continue these discussions. So just let me know and feel free to come off mute if something is particularly relevant or needs to be addressed at a particular moment. So without further ado, perhaps I will just then move into the slideshow. I can't really see the chat, so it's best if you come off mute if there's something that needs to be addressed. Everyone can see it okay and hear me okay? Great.
Yes.
Super, thanks. So I suppose that if you're here, it comes as no surprise that we are in the midst of a major ecological catastrophe that we're finding manifest in extreme weather events, unmanageable fires, loss of biodiversity, depletion of resources, pollution of air, water, and soil, prolonged droughts, and mass extinction. That just feels like it's in California. Scientists concur that we're crossing threshold after threshold, barreling toward a point of no return. Ecosystems are on the verge of collapse, and as part of these systems of life, we too are on the verge of cataclysm. The reports by the IPCC have made these facts eminently clear. 3.6 billion people are at risk of catastrophic impact from human-induced climate change in just the next few decades. These statistics amount to the greatest moral and existential crisis of our day, one that should prompt us to be considering our ways of acting, thinking, and being in this world. But in part because of their magnitude and complexity, even cataclysmic reports and dramatic models do not seem to be motivating large-scale change. If the science is in, the jury is still out. How will we respond? In what follows, I'm going to make the case that we should be taking religion seriously in developing a strong and toothsome environmental ethic that challenges our assumptions and our patterns of actions and governance. Now, of course, I don't mean to discuss religion in the abstract. As a scholar of Jewish studies, as a member of the Jewish communities, as an ordained rabbi, I write and teach from that place. The sources of Judaism, law, philosophy, theology, and ritual, have a particular voice to bring to this deliberation, and so do those of other religious traditions, which can and should be learning from one another, but which do not all say the same thing. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, and Judaism, all of these have many local subcultures in dialogue with the regions in which they have flourished. And I should add that the leaders and practitioners of these many religious traditions have much to learn from indigenous communities and First Peoples across the globe. So I'd like to, in what follows, look at the deep literatures of Judaism, the ancient cultural wisdom coming from a complicated territorial space, the land of Israel, also the books, liturgies, and poems written in the wake of exile and throughout the incredibly creative time of the Jewish diaspora. In order to really dig into this work, we need to do some initial term defining. One is that Judaism presents a robust normative system of obligations and rituals. That's how I understand halacha, not as law per se. Here, I think a helpful cognate really is found in al-Sharia. These injunctions and prohibitions are linked to a broader discourse of theological, philosophical, sometimes ethical, and intellectual meaning. That's Agadah. These non-legal fields of inquiry and reflection shape the formulation of Jewish law, ensuring that the praxis of Judaism and its obligations reflect its deepest spiritual and ethical values, or at least it should. Both of these domains have something to offer contemporary environmental thinking, and building a bridge between them can serve as a model for the integration of ethics and narrative on one hand, and law and regulation on the other. The Odyssey that before us begins with two very simple questions. And I'll talk more about these mushrooms in just a moment. The first is sustainability incompatible with modernity, or at least with our version thereof? So much of modern thinking is defined by the march of progress, the valorization of endless expansion and growth, the assumptions about the stability of the physical world, and so forth. Across the past 3 centuries, this rift between nature and culture, or the alleged rift, between our bodies and the natural world, has been increasingly amplified. Modern literature and philosophy tend to focus on the individual as the primary moral agent and actor, either abstracted from the non-human world or as overcoming it. As it pertains to the subject of ecology, I subscribe to the notion that in many respects, postmodernity is actually a kind of hypermodernity or supermodernity, a process that Hartmut Rosa calls social acceleration that has only increased across the past 4 decades. Responses grounded in that type of market individualism have failed to generate collective action. We've seen the tremendous and unprecedented advances in technical, temporal, and social levels, but these have left us as a species spinning. Our social institutions, many of which are grounded in particular kinds of ideologies and visions of globalization, often efface the local, the distinct, and they have yet to catch up. This, along with what Bruno Latour has called the vertiginous explosion of inequality. None of this is sustainable. So we need to be thinking about how to remake social, economic, and intellectual systems in light of a different frame of mind, namely that we inhabit a porous and interconnected world, one that is united by a vast and complex interchange of natural forces that are not necessarily hospitable, and which seem to become increasingly less so. Though this Earth system largely operates according to a set of physical and biological principles, the unfolding story of this planet is dynamic, and it's not always pretty. The active responses of our lands can intrude upon our assumptions that this world is static. If sustainability is incompatible with our type of non-isometric modernity, we need to be looking for new thought worlds, what Rudine Bishop calls mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, sources that force us to reflect upon our situation and our behavior, allow us to gaze upon alternative possibilities through the window of possibility, and eventually to walk forward through the doorway of those new realities. So the second question is also kind of simple. Why religion? How can engagement with religious traditions help us going about developing a response? The field of religion and ecology and its many different isotopes largely emerged from Lynn White Jr.'s indictment of religion in 1967 as a cause of the climate emergency, there in only embryonic form. His accusations, cited thousands of times in the decades to follow, set religious thinkers and practitioners back on their heels. Some doubled down, attempting to undercut the science that explains climate change. Just look at the news in America and you'll see plenty of that. Others attempt to green ancient traditions through heavy-handed reinterpretation, showing that values like, well, sustainability have really been there all along and they were just ignored. Others have mined religious literatures, and I use that kind of extractive word intentionally, looking for notions that are analogous to contemporary environmental keywords. For example, how do you say stewardship in Jewish? These approaches do little more than repeat our existing paradigms without offering alternative worldviews or ethical frameworks. So to address these dire environmental problems, my argument is that we need to perform the deeper work of exploring traditional sources with an eye to alternative modes of theorization and valuation that can unseat our assumptions about humanity and our relationship to the non-human world. Here I cite the work of James Miller on Taoism and the work of Anna Gade, her book on Muslim environmentalisms, as first steps forward in this process. Okay, so you're still wondering, why religion? Religions are large transnational organizations that can prompt huge numbers, billions of people to work together. This possibility allows for collective action across continents and institutions of governance, and it's a key contribution. Though, of course, we must be honest. Religions also promote disunity, fracture, and national self-interest. Religions can also help us conceive of obligations toward future generations, a thorny issue in Western philosophy as well as in regulation. But religions can also help us think beyond our very high capacity for what philosophers call epistemic opacity, the ability to pretend that we don't see a wall until we quite literally run into it. Catastrophe is no stranger to religion, and these sources and communities have a rich language for addressing it. More importantly, religious literatures and rituals represent alternative modes of moral reasoning, of value assignment, of social organization that give us an alternative to our current systems. For anyone who is interested, I very much commend the work of Amitav Ghosh, both on this subject, which he kind of just pushes the boat out on, and on many others, in particular, the imbrication of issues around economic development and world devastation. He puts on the table the notion of the sacred as an important dimension of religion, which I would say is a kind of portal for thinking about the entire thought world of religion. But just to stay with that for a second, Moshe Halbertal, who probably needs no introduction here, has argued that classical Judaism defines objects, spaces, and times as holy if they're beyond the range of human instrumentalization, if they can't be used for extractive, personal, or material benefit. It's a great way of thinking about holy time, holy space, holy objects. And so a conception of that which is sacred triggers obligations of limit setting, responsibility, and connection. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that the pre-modern roots of religious thought permit us to challenge our paradigms. Wittgenstein is famous for having said that the job of philosophy is to lead the fly out of the fly trap. And I think the same is true of religion. Jewish thought has a long tradition of grappling with how to incorporate the findings of science. The exchange rarely favors one extreme over the other, and various forms of synthesis were advanced. Many religious communities have modeled a kind of cultural expression through interdisciplinarity in which sciences like botany, chemistry, biology, geography, and mathematics go hand in hand with aesthetics, philosophy, humanities, ethics, law, and theology. Classical Islam may be held up as a kind of gold standard for this multifaceted or multifactorial approach to human knowledge and ways of being in the world, but medieval Judaism, later Judaism, even biblical Judaism, each has something to add to this. So in our case, scientific information and method are absolutely critical for understanding the mechanisms and implications of climate change, and they will help us establish solutions. But at the same time, an ideology in which all questions are tackled by science alone, what Pope Francis called scientism in that famous encyclical, can't provide us with answers, with an ethical framework, nor can it help us dismantle the economic, philosophical, or social structures that have led us to this point. Science can critique religious sources, but religious modes of reasoning and narrative ought to be able to return the favor. In academia and in interfaith work, we often talk about building bridges. In his essay, Building Dwelling Thinking, Heidegger describes the constructive power of the bridge as defining the experience of space and landscape. Quote, The bridge swings over the stream with ease and power. It does not just connect banks that are already there. The banks emerge as banks only as the bridge crosses the stream. The bridge designedly causes them to lie across from each other. One side is set off against the other by the bridge. According to Heidegger, the bridge defines the space by turning distinctive features of a single landscape into opposing banks. Bridges can divide. They come in many different forms. Some connect through exclusion. Some are one way. Some are hulking steel-cabled monuments to industrialism. It requires great care to build bridges, physical, academic, intercommunal, that connect rather than divide. And in a sense, I think that religion doesn't just help us in this bridge work. Religions can help offer a different kind of non-bisecting vision, a way of looking at the many and various disciplines that must be brought to bear in the study of sustainability so that they don't remain on the opposite banks, but integrate within a single, delightfully marshy landscape of possibilities. Okay. So far, so good? Fantastic. In our tour of Jewish sources, which are going to appear on this screen with shameful rapidity, I'd like to point out 4 specific issues and themes that demand thinking or working across fields and which I think are very much of moment. The first has to do with facing the magnitude of our catastrophe and the urge to solve it with technology. We often talk about running out of time or acting before it's too late. But it's hard, and harder still, to say that it's already too late. Tragedy and apocalypse are no strangers to religion and to indigenous thinkers. In fact, for many, the world has already ended. For Black theologians writing in America, the enslavement of Africans was the end of a world, but one that happened more than once during the century and a half of oppression and murder that came in the wake of the 13th and 14th Amendments. Plenty Approach is said to have explained, "When the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened." End quote. William Gibson was famous for having said that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. I'm a little bit less sanguine. So building on that, I think that the world is already ending, but that ending is not yet evenly distributed. And the first step in meeting the present moment is not to rush to solutions, but to recognize the situation for what it is, looking at ecological travesty of tragedies of mind, action, and systems that have led us here. Judaism, I think, has deep resources for thinking about devastation and rebirth. When I'm asked to teach about Judaism and the environment and communities in America, generally I try to surprise people, not by beginning with the beauties of Genesis, but with biblical verses that mourn the destruction of the temple and live through it. The first here, from the book of Jeremiah, quotes individuals who are lodged in the seat of power, who cannot conceive of real destruction. Surely God won't bring down God's own house. By refusing to acknowledge the frailty of that situation, the precariousness of their entire world, these individuals cannot address the problems at the heart of the matter. That's kind of a good summary of the entire section of the Nevi'im. The second quote here from the book of Eicha, from Lamentations, bespeaks a yearning for redemption and deliverance, even amid the devastation of the city of Jerusalem. The totality of destruction is inconceivable precisely because the speaker cannot face it without looking for a solution that comes, well, as a kind of definitional deus ex machina. Jewish environmental thinking in our age, I think, begins not with the appreciative romance of creation, but with these hardened expressions of exile and failure with which those prophetic books are filled. I turn to the work of Maimonides, that great medieval jurist and theologian who highlights the values of responsibility when we are confronted with difficult and even seemingly imponderable situations. He demands in the time of suffering, in this case, the time of famine or of drought, responsibility, collective and personal as the only proper ethical response to tragedy. He says that if you just say, this is the way that the world is, or this is the way that the world continues to roll on its merry way, that is akhzariyut. It's cruelty to remove one's own responsibility. Some versions of this kind of theology might have a naive cause and effect. My car is crushed under a tree, so I must have been a sinner. But on the other hand, I think Maimonides is calling us to remember that the world around us is very much shaped by our actions, and that non-attention to those actions and to the human cost that they have can lead to devastating consequences. Modernity has taught us to see that the world is stable. That's a kind of old Aristotelian trope connected to the pre-existence of the world and given additional texture by medieval thinkers. Jewish sources don't necessarily see that as the case. One early modern source for this is Rabbi Moshe Isserles's Torah Ta'olah, in which the Ramah of Krakow thinks through the implications of a world that might well come to an end. He's thinking there in terms of the cosmic cycles, I'll talk about those in just a second, and trying to understand the nature of religious living on the edge of destruction. Here we might also turn our heads to what the Kabbalists have called Torat HaShmitot, the notion that the world shifts and changes in sometimes enormous and axiomatic ways, sometimes that are even unthinkable, collapsing only to be reborn. Now, I think we probably all know that a mindset of crisis doesn't spur individuals or societies to reinterpret or reevaluate their moral, economic, or legal frameworks. Anyone here ever been in a fight with someone they love? Surely not, right? Doesn't necessarily bring out the best in us. Paradigms of emergency or catastrophe can lead to several different things. One is fearful conservatism, preserving my way of life, and the rejection of change. And another is a kind of bewildered paralysis, indecision, or to massive changes that come at the expense of anyone who doesn't have a seat at the table. These eventualities, all of them, hamper our efforts to think through and respond to the challenges of what we are facing. And in fact, I think we see that on a daily basis. On this note, I commend the work of Kyle White, an indigenous philosopher. He teaches at the University of Michigan and a scholar of environmental studies, who's demonstrated the inadequacy of what he calls epistemologies of crisis for confronting climate change. He points out that when we are faced with seismic environmental shifts that threaten our way of life, societies and their laws all too often fall back on the very tools and structures that have brought them to that point. White presents an alternative, epistemologies of coordination, ways of knowing, this is what he says, ways of knowing the world that emphasize the importance of moral bonds or kinship relationships for generating the responsible capacity to respond to constant change in the world. Coordination, in other words, enables us to search for answers and response. The picture here is of a brilliant natural phenomenon called murmuration. If you've never heard of it, look it up. It's what we need to be doing. Assuming, it's something birds do, assuming that carbon emissions won't be dramatically diminished, a datum that seems to be more sure with every passing moment, despite the things that are being said at the COP27, this is the question we need to ask. How do we live together in a complicated, even collapsing world? Such an acceptance might allow us to do what Vanessa Andreotti calls hospicing the world. But like the matsutake mushroom described by Anna Tsing in her marvelous book, that's the mushroom that I showed you earlier, it's a fungus that grows amid the rubble of devastated pine forests, and that's the only place it really grows. We need to develop pathways of resilience in the rubble of our time. And at the same time, we need to be thinking, how do we actually go about creating a better world? Technology is not the only answer, although I think it is an answer and a key part of the answer. Look, I teach at Stanford. I live sort of adjacent to Silicon Valley. Every time we bring up these problems, immediately this is where the conversation goes. Carbon sequestering, terraforming, plastic vacuums, geoengineering, etc., etc. These treat symptoms, and more often than not, they actually just reflect the deeper malaise. Judaism, at least as I understand the medieval sources and the modern sources, reject technological determinism. Not everything that can be done ought to be done. Here, too, I think that Pope Francis's remarks on technocracy and the naive over-adulation of science in Laudato Si is an important corrective. Here I offer two examples from our tradition. The first highlights the power of technology as the kind of graven or false god. Bereshit Rabbah connects the yearning for technical mastery in order to stave off ecological calamity, moving together the story of the Tower of Babel and the flood. The story of Babel is long identified as a tale warning against human hubris. So what do people say? Build higher, grow. We can hold up the heavens despite the fact that it seems like everything is collapsing. If we just perfect the technology, then maybe we can have an ever-expanding GDP somehow within this world of finite resources. But technology can't change the fact that we and some of the 95% of the species that have co-evolved together with us across the past millennia cannot live on the planet that we are creating. A second tradition deals with one of the best known Jewish legends, that of the golem. After this creature is created, it grows and grows until it's out of control. The owner erases the name of God from its forehead, but then the creation itself strikes him on the forehead in that very same place. So rather than highlighting the power of the supernatural to guard us, this particular text highlights the reflexive hazards of the things that we create. For my generation, that was the Skynet of the Terminator franchise. For the next generation, I think it's just called social media. The things that we create control us. And for all of us, the solutions mindset, which is endemic to much of contemporary environmental thinking, can actually be a part of the problem. Lynn White noted, I personally doubt that disastrous ecological backlash can be avoided simply by applying to our problems more science and more technology. This warning ought to be echoed many times over. In terms of living with brokenness, I find myself drawn to poetry. The work of Jane Hirschfeld, for example, her stirring requiem, Ghazal for the End of Time, is a beautiful poem, a difficult poem, in which devastation becomes so unspeakably great that death itself declares, now I, too, am an orphan. I'm also drawn to the work of Zelda, of the Israeli poet Zelda Schneerson-Mishkovsky, whose writing celebrates the miracle of the ordinary, but her poems are filled with heroes like fish, butterflies, skies, and trees. But her work is not only jejune. Ancient Pines, the poem before you, recalls the devastation of a landscape after the melting of the snows. She laments the destroyed interiority of those trees, doubly violated because they've not been cut down gently and with respect, but in the throes of wanton destruction. That, she says, is murder. Thomas Berry noted that poets and artists can help us restore a sense of rapport with the natural world. This sense of reciprocity with nature in all of its complexity and remarkable beauty can help provide the psychic and spiritual energies necessary for the work ahead. I entirely agree. Donna Haraway has advocated for something that she calls staying with the trouble. Rather than averting our eyes or pretending that it's not happened or looking immediately for solutions, we have to acknowledge that in some respects, it's already too late. One of our great myths is called Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels, a story in which God radiates sacred light into a series of emanations, catchment reservoirs for that divine vitality. But as they become full and overfull, they buckle and shatter against the weightiness of this radiance. They break, scattering sparks or droplets of that divine light throughout the cosmos. And the project of religious living and of human existence is discovering those broken fragments throughout the world and returning them to their rightful place through action and courage. That requires a willingness to be frank about the brokenness of our moment, which can inform our approach both to environmental education and to activism, shifting from a preventative mindset to one that grapples with equity, resilience, and change amid devastation. we have to look, I think, for what Krista Tippett calls the generative narrative of our time. That's her phrase, the generative narrative of our time. How does decay lead to growth? How can our present moment become like a fallen redwood, serving as a nurse tree for further growth? How can we also, at the same time, hold these truths together with a narrative of potential abundance rooted in the present? In order to find those narratives, we have to find new stories. We need mythic stories that tell us about our land and about our place and about God's place within the cosmos. This is the second domain of thinking in which I think religion is critical. Scholars of environmental studies have long noted that we need new narratives. We need new myths. And I think what we need is what the Zohar calls milin chadatin atikin, old, new narratives. One possible myth that comes to us from the Jewish past is that of pantheism, or panentheism, if you'd rather. An ancient name for God is Hamakom, the place. And while Judaism is not geographically neutral, it tells a bigger story about than the connection of a particular place and a particular people in a particular land. A mystical source here from the 18th century dared to speak of God in terms that would have been abhorrent to those involved in the famous pantheism controversy that embroiled German-speaking philosophers at that same time in the 18th century. He doesn't use this phrase, it's elsewhere in the Hasidic canon, but it's very simple. Alles is Gott. Everything is God. Such myths leave no room for a human or nature binary or perhaps even hierarchy. We are described as a part of the economy of life, of vitality, of breath become air become life, of sacred vitality that is circulated as divinity suffuses all aspects of the cosmos. It is, in a sense, the end of nature, not in Bill McKibben's sense of the reach of spoilage, but in Timothy Morton's sense that the external projection of nature must be overcome in order to understand that we are a part of this world. How might we go about generating a toothsome ethic grounded in this way of looking at the world? Mary Jane Rubenstein, one of my favorite scholars who wrote a great book called Pan-Theologies, has suggested it's actually kind of simple. We just need to be nature better. Okay, I want to know how, but I like the sentiment. How might an awareness that God is everywhere, expressed in all forms of life, as well as in the physical landscapes of our planet, change our relationship to the non-human world? Another re-envisioning of our narrative comes from the Zohar, that great book of medieval mysticism in which the world and the land is dynamic, once immanent and transcendent. The Zohar describes God as in need of human action. We are called the tenders of the sacred well. And as water rushes into the cosmos, we channel and funnel that blessing into the world. It also acknowledges the complex interrelationship of all the elements of the world, the imbrication of the many garments all linked together, inner and outer, but not necessarily hierarchical. Like that infinitely dazzling and reflective array of jewels in Indra's net, a Buddhist symbol for the dependent origination and interpenetration of all being, the Zohar's parable underscores that everything in this world is linked to everything else. Again, we need to generate a strong ethic founded in this way of looking at the world. Both of these accounts, the mystical, the mythic, the panentheistic, give us a world that shimmers. Shimmering is a word I used for, I don't know, a couple of decades, until someone pointed out to me the work of the late anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose, who describes a Yungu Aboriginal word. It's called biryun in the original, or brilliance, or shimmering. And she describes it as a radiant quality that allows you or brings you into the experience of being part of a vibrant and vibrating world. This is exactly what I think the sources of Judaism are calling us to. It also means, as Deborah Bird-Rose points out, one's actual capacity to see and to experience ancestral power. It's not that hard to find a passage in the Zohar, in fact, it's on every page, in which the people who are the heroes of the Zohar, the comrades, the Chavraya, who are roving around the land of Israel, encountering rocks, mountains, and streams, they see the physical world around them, and it reminds them that here is a place for creativity. The textscape, the landscape, the selfscape, all of these converge, and we are invited into a kind of encounter with the physical world that leads to a human creativity that acknowledges the power of things. So this brings me to another point, and that's the idea of the land as an agent. In the Bible, it is God who commands, but it is the land who acts. If you look at the differences in the descriptions of Shemitah in the books of Shemot and Dvarim versus the book of Vayikra, the book of Vayikra describes the land as a subject, nominally, grammatically, and maybe even theologically. The land is the actor. So the world can and will flex, acting in response, perhaps, to our over-extraction, from fracking and pit mining to industrialized agribusiness and massive air pollution. We won't look at it together, but I commend it to you. One Hasidic rabbi goes even farther, noting that the passive formulation in the biblical text about the flood, he describes the flood that overtakes the world as what he calls a hashlacha. It's a consequence. It's a consequence to human action. This vision of the empowered landscape gives us a helpful language for thinking about what Isabella Stengers and Bruno Latour describe as the forceful interruption of Gaia, a power with which we must reckon and which we cannot control. The mythic idiom can give us a helpful language for conceiving of the terrifying data and frightening models that earth science has given us. Rather than a planet that's defined by stability, ours is an increasingly volatile and complex world that must be approached not as an object, but as a subject and as an actor. This focus on land and on place reminds us of the need to think locally while also keeping our eye on that big picture. So I know that that's kind of a hackneyed truism, but here's what I mean. Solutions from the top are unlikely, especially given the current political climate. And local activism at the grassroots and communal level seems to have a much better chance of sparking systemic change. To a historian, this may not be any surprise. Living locally is actually part of what Bruno Latour describes as coming down to earth, remembering that we are terrestrial beings, very much linked to a place and existing within just as we exist within a broader planetary landscape. It's not enough for individuals or communities to make choices on the small scale, but that's where we need to begin. We think with what Aldo Leopold describes as the land community, the specific, earthy, loamy place, and those who dwell upon it. Wendell Berry says that, like other species, we will have to submit to the necessity of local adaptation. I love that. This truth is at odds with our global pretensions. Yeah, is that a hand up? Please.
Yes. Haven't you just said that those forces are beyond our control? I found that very compelling in the text in front of us.
Yeah.
How does this call for local action if those forces are beyond us?
So many of us who are thinking about how to respond to climate change get stuck between, well, let's call it a rock and a hard place. One other person in America can totally offset everything that I've done, not to mention coal-fired power plants, not to mention X, Y, and Z on an enormous global scale. On the other hand, there was a great essay in a philosophy journal about 2 decades ago in response to a kind of philosophical version of that really abhorrent article in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago about systemic racism in America. If systemic racism in America is a thing, then we don't have to really respond to it because it's systemic, and therefore I have no moral obligation to respond to it, which made me pull my hair out. So this article in the philosophy journal, I don't actually remember who it was by, said that, you know, the thought experiment about the Great Sunday Drive, which was an American pastime for several decades, you just go drive in a car on Sunday and that's what you do. That's not really the cause of climate change. It's the industry, it's this and that. On the other hand, climate change comes from somewhere, and it is a concatenation of different impacts. And although we cannot respond or change all of them, nor can we build levees or shoot confetti into the air to control sun absorption and try and reflect the sun back, which is like the great new thing that Silicon Valley people are talking about, we cannot create holistic solutions that will allow us to continue to live in our way. On the other hand, local change can transform the way that small communities experience everything from resilience in the face of climate change, working together as opposed to doing nothing or fighting with one another. And here, I think regionally, as well as on an even sort of more bucolic local level, a friend of mine once suggested, in California, we have earthquake coordinators on every block, and they hold all the different resources. They have a generator, and there's one for every, let's say, 3-block radius. What if we had local sustainability coordinators that worked with everyone in our neighborhood? And what if we did that reaching across party lines, reaching across certain kinds of socioeconomic lines? What if we did this regionally, reaching across the lines that divide us? That becomes a powerful agent of change that I have much more faith in, rather than thinking about whether or not the Supreme Court will gut or enforce the EPA. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I'm sorry I interrupted you. It just was incompatible with the text.
Yeah, for sure.
I didn't see how you logically go from this fatalistic text to pragmatic solutions on a small scale.
So I'm going to move into some solutions now and different ways of thinking, but I think that's the tension, which is, on the one hand, even if you and I and everyone stopped what we were doing, the next 60 years are not really going to change. It's going to be perhaps less terrible than it would otherwise, but there are processes set in motion now that we can't stop. And we're not stopping. And there's nothing that I or you can individually do to change the course of that giant cruise ship that we're all on. On the other hand, acknowledging that leads to paralysis if we don't believe in the fact that individuals can make a difference in their community, and that those communal efforts can unite together into some kind of collective action. And for that, I really do think that on the one hand, you can hold the truth that the hashlachot of what we have wrought will be brought back to us in the form of floods and fires and despeciation and all of these other things. And at the same time, I refuse to believe that human action is meaningless in spite of that. I think that it is precisely acknowledging the problem that allows us to find alternative narratives and then to begin moving with a sense of conviction. And I don't think that that's going to happen, at least in America, at the federal level. I think that it's going to happen on the small level. I think it's going to happen at the local level. I think it's going to happen by block, by city, maybe by state, but really I think it's going to come down to people who have to live together. The people who have to live together. Okay, good. Thank you for that question. Amazing. So what are we to do? Oy vey. We need to rethink the place of the human being, and that happens at local levels and grand scales. And I think we do need to get over this false dichotomy of human versus nature. Obviously, many people are calling for this, seeing oikos as a part of the oikos, the house of ecology, and the network of connection, reciprocity, and obligation that connection then demands. So here I think that the third domain that Jewish discourse really has to bring is that we have a paradigm of kinship with the non-human world, of responsibility for, but also together with. And I'm sure that David's work is familiar to everyone here, but I would commend to you the work of David Shayevitz in both his forthcoming book and his previous monograph on exactly these subjects. In Judaism, in the rabbinic tradition, and certainly in the medieval Kabbalistic and early modern Kabbalistic traditions, human beings are described as gardeners and caretakers. It's interesting, in Hasidism, the metaphor of the garden almost entirely disappears for a couple of centuries, and then it reappears when people move to Israel and gardens are once more an important part of their culture, and then it reappears in Hasidism. The garden metaphor is so key for us. Rather than conquering or subduing the animals of this world, we are called to preserve and to work this world as a kind of sacred trust. And rather than a vision of the pristine wilderness that has guided so much of the American mind, I've always liked the fact that Jewish sources refer to paradise as one in which human beings live together with the flora and fauna, not as some sort of unspoiled universe, but within a single network of complex living. If the first story of Genesis puts human beings within some sort of a creative hierarchy, the second, and that tale of the garden that we all live with, imagines human beings within a terrestrial realm in which they're connected to the animals with a wisdom so great that we are the ones who are charged with naming them. And we'll see in just a moment that perhaps that favor goes in the opposite direction as well. Stewardship is often overused as a kind of noblesse oblige, but on the other hand, it is a core value of Judaism. We live in community with the land and in conversation with its inhabitants, and that web of reciprocity and mutual obligation is key to our divine charge. So I think that maybe a revised, heavily revised anthropocentric focus of Judaism can actually be, as they say in my neck of the woods, a feature, not a bug, in the Anthropocene. Whether we start the Anthropocene at 1492, or the rise of colonialism, or the first or the second industrial revolution, or the post-war atomic age, whatever, human beings are now shaping the world in tremendous ways. We're not the only ones who shape the world. Beavers build dams, moles farm and stockpile worms, termite construct magnificent skyscrapers, but we do that kind of thing at a scale and with a potential for destruction that is unique among the forms of life on this planet. One daring Hasidic source, the Beit Yaakov from the mid-19th century, perhaps reflecting a reflection of having been written in Poland as it was just beginning to industrialize, as they were chopping down forests for the railroads, describes our sense of imbricated community with the animals as nurturing an ethos of responsibility, at least in potential. This obligation comes not with our creation, but before our creation. The author of this source brings together the rabbinic midrash about every animal being asked, do you wish to be created, every species in some sense, together with the famous midrash about whether or not God should create people, and the different character traits say yes or no. Human beings are going to be filled with lies, but they have the capacity to love, etc., etc. Here, all beings, all forms of life are asked, do they consent to our creation? So the mysterious us in the divine declaration of we let us make humanity in our image, Na'aseh Adam, it's not the royal we, or as the rabbinic tradition has it, it's not the angels, but here in this source, the we is the sum totality of the symphony of creation in all of its polyphonic and vast richness. They say all of the other animals consent to our creation. Why? We don't know. Despite the fact that we have what this source describes as the power lekalkel uleafsid, to destroy, to ruin, we are given the gift of creation. This consent from the other animals, I would argue, triggers obligation, and it commands our attention to our place in this more than human world. Maimonides, amongst the many others, reminds us that the world is not here for our pleasure. The things of this world are not simply potential extractions, but things that exist for their own reasons. Here, I pivot from the book of Echa to the book of Job. Job reminds us to wonder about the uniqueness of animal life. This is in the last chapters. The horse, the ostrich, the goat, the wild ox. These animals, say the book of Job, or say God in the book of Job, exist. The horse, horses. The goat, goats. The ox, oxes. I haven't figured out how to say that in Hebrew. We can only witness the mystery of those animals doing their thing and imagine what philosophers call their Umwelt, their unique perspective and habits. Derrida notes that the word animal is a stupid word. It's a word that makes us stupid by feeding our ego-driven conception of humanity at the summit of creation and dividing us from all other non-human forms of life, which we are not. But we also don't encounter all life in some sort of a Platonic sense in every moment. Orientation and engagement actually begins with a single encounter of depth. One of my favorite poems by Zelda is Eineni ohevet et kol ha'etzim shaveh. I don't love all trees equally. The Talmud describes, and here you have the text, a story in which the rabbi asks, how do we bless the tree before whom we are standing? It has everything that it needs. All we can do for such a tree is to let it exist through the engenderment of its own progeny on its own terms. We bless the tree that it and its children may continue to tree. I, thou, Martin Buber's famous philosophical book on dialogical encounter, well, his arch example is encountering a tree, seeing it for something textured, specific, and local, not as the grand embodiment of treeness, but as something very specific, a companion that stands in front of you. Robin Wall Kimmerer, in her famous book, Braiding Sweetgrass, notes the importance of learning the songs of the plants around us, not just the scientific names. This intimate kind of knowledge is an awareness of what Deborah Bird Rose called the shimmering musicality of that world around us. Reading that, I returned back to something that I had seen in Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav many years previous, in which each animal has a song that is spun forth from its relationship with the ground. And the shepherd then learns that song, the song of her or his own life, from those animals and the land across which they wander, and then gives it back to them as a kind of network of shared melody. Here too, the axis, I think, is reciprocity. As the shepherd learns, the arc of melody stretches in both directions. These sources, all of those that we've been looking at in this section, stretch across speciative lines. So the non-human world is one in which we are bound to, for one from which we learn and with which we live in a community of reciprocity. To these sources, I would just say one more, which is that we all probably know that famous passage in the Talmud that says that if the Torah had not been given, we would learn this midah from this particular animal and this midah from that particular animal, and everything is great because we'd be able to see the world, see the Torah from the world, which I think is beautiful. I also wonder what would happen if we didn't just look at the animals as giving us our Torah, but as thinking about what might be the Torah of those animals. What would the Torah of the ox be, the horse, the goat, each in their own unique and non-anthropomorphic form? So finally, I come to a fourth area, and that is the world of obligation and legal and moral responsibility. Here in Jewish tort law, Hilchot Nezikin offers a very important corrective. This is a great insight that the noted legal scholar Robert Cover put forward decades ago. American law is primarily rooted in rights, which profound rhetorical heft, but as he points out, rights are singularly weak in providing the material guarantees of life and dignity flowing from community to the individual. Cover also notes that when central authority is lacking and when forced coercion is not a possibility, then we need to find the mythic center of the law. Common, mutual, reciprocal obligation is necessary. End quote. So the struggle to develop an alternative language for comprehending and addressing the relations between economic structures and environmental exploitation stems in part from a combination of the trans-jurisdictional nature of the global challenge and the legal and social default toward market individualism, which might be rooted in American discourse, but which is certainly stretched all across the world. Rabbinic law doesn't provide a wholesale transferable solution to contemporary problems, but it offers a robust accounting and a different mindset, a cultural mind, if you will, in which socially embedded duties and commitments to other human parties in the non-human world are pushed to the forefront. Obligations-based jurisprudence gives us a framework moving away from technological capacity and economic advancement to one that focuses on the capacity and the institutions of human actors which can keep pace with our ability to impact and harm the biosphere. Of course, industry is not forbidden by Jewish law, even if businesses create a certain level of noise, air, or even water pollutants. But communities are meant to be livable and sustainable for both human and non-human actors, and Talmudic sources demonstrate a careful calculus that balances economic productivity with collective flourishing. So I've spent much time over the years developing 3 different categories. I'll just tell you them in very brief. One is fire, one of the cardinal categories of damage, which is inclusive of inanimate damage-causing forces that cause harm to person or property while they are moved by an external force. This is a precedent vocabulary for speaking about a whole range of modern environmental pollutants, from caustic and toxic chemicals to proven carcinogens and other kinds of harmful waste carried by the wind or that leach into groundwater. Or the pit includes non-mobile but dangerous objects, encompasses everything from the obvious modern corollary like open pit mining to something more specific. Here, I think there are actually 2 dimensions of this that are critical. The first is that rabbinic discussions consider the placement of liability if multiple individuals share ownership of one of these uncovered pits, thus giving us a way to think about the multiple or joint tortfeasors, which American law and international law really struggle with. And in a world of the ever-increasing, what's called the responsibility gap, this is critical. A second dimension, and one that I think is even more compelling, at least for me, is that the idea of bore gives us a way of thinking about the cumulative potential of hazards to inflict harm. There's this humorous example that you have before you about what happens when you dig a pit within another pit, which seems like an exercise in how many angels can dance on the tip of a pen, actually addresses this issue. To whom does liability fall when an individual adds on the necessary measure, turning a pit from an annoying hindrance into a lethal object capable of killing? This, I think, is an excellent model for thinking about what the philosopher Bob Nixon calls slow violence, something that happens over decades or even centuries. I also think about it in terms of the moral responsibility of those who might live in a generation that pushes the world beyond its threshold. Finally, a third category, the rabbinic discussions of damage to or from one's neighbors, demands that we do not externalize damage to others and to the world simply as the cost of doing business. So together, all of these help us conceptualize damage caused by coal, smoke, open pit mining, radiation, plastic pollution, human-induced and exacerbated wildfires, as well as a host of extractive and corrosive actions that yield a wicked harvest indeed. To these, I would also add a 4th category called Hashavat Aveda, the obligation to return lost objects, which also expands to saving the life of another person or their property from inundation, flooding, and other kinds of exigencies. Security, then, is something that we owe unto others, and you must fight to protect it for them. Given that environmental collapse will yield, and is in fact already yielding, major human costs, refugees will be an ever more present part of our world, and we may well be among them. So, as I come to a close, as a religious person, I'm guided by the words of the noted theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel, who writes, "Creative dissent comes out of love and faith, offering positive alternatives of vision. The scarcity of creative dissent today may be explained by the absence of assets that make creative dissent possible. Deep caring, concern, untrammeled radical thinking informed by rich learning, a degree of audacity and courage, and the power of the word. The dearth of people who are rooted in Jewish learning and who think clearly and care deeply, who are endowed with both courage and the power of the word, may account for the spiritual vacuum of the state of religious existence today." End quote. The power to spark transformation, to levy critique, and to build alternatives is rooted in a sense of commitment to the past. When we're stuck, when our present is defined by stagnation, fear, and small-mindedness, that's the time to build bridges. We need new modes of thinking that highlight networks of obligation, and we need new theology, narrative, and myth. While we must mobilize the full might of scientific craft, we need the humanities and religious studies and religion to blow wind into those sails and to set the proper course. And to that end, we need each other in our local communities, in our communities of faith, and across all lines and intersections of encounter and identity. We live in a common home, which is in fact our only home. We need to continue to build those bridges between regulation and narrative, between religion and science, between local and global, between indigenous communities and multinational religious traditions, between those who inhabit the shared territorial space, between activism and the academy. These bridges need to be supple, multi-directional, fault-tolerant, and inclusive, rather than Heidegger's kind of monstrosity, that bridge that splits between something. I think we need bridges that are like the focal point in Monet's painting, bridges that foster soft yet stable connectivity, linking disparate nodes without the radiance of each flower, lily pad, willow, and bulrush being obscured. Rather than fracturing the scholarly landscape, such bridges remind us that the boundaries of knowledge are porous and permeable, much like the connections that link the vast array of vital phenomena of our planet and its systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel, for that wonderful lecture. It was really brilliant. I just really appreciated the both depth of scholarship which you brought there, but also your personal drive and feeling that was very palpable. I guess I'll open the floor up for any questions or comments.
Please.
Well, I will go first then and
So.
say two thoughts that first came to mind. First of all, I happen to be at this moment reading a really fascinating book on an entirely different topic, which is An Unchosen People by Kenneth Moth from University of Chicago, where his book is looking at Jewish political reckoning in interwar Poland and Jewish intellectuals in Poland trying to basically come to terms with a sense of disaster or something that they can't quite stop. And once you come to that recognition, how do you avoid paralysis and then try to find some sort of course of action despite the sense of impending catastrophe? So I think that there is definitely much to learn there. I also was really struck by sort of the turn to Jewish sources for a sense of stewardship or connection to land that was not necessarily one of working or developing, which I think is when I think of developments in modern Jewish thought in connection with earth and land, one of the first things that comes to mind is Zionism, which is trying to revitalize or recreate a Jewish connection to the earth, to the land. But there, so much of the focus is upon, I would say, development and control. And I think this element of stewardship, which definitely should be an element, I think has been perhaps somewhat overlooked. As you noted, as you yourself said, you're not sure how to say stewardship in Hebrew.
Yeah. In regards to Ken's book, I think that's right. It's one of the many examples of Jewish thinkers who have a study of Jews in Poland thinking about their fate and the fate of the entire project of a territorialist mindset. I think that's one example amongst the many different nodes along this way of thinking. We could go to the end of Iberian Judaism. We could think about all sorts of different moments in which these kinds of American scholars talk about this thing called a constitutional moment, something so strange and interruptive that it makes them rethink the entire legal system and its implications. The Trump presidency was described as one of those. No one has yet, or I guess no one other than me, has said that the climate crisis needs to be a constitutional moment of profound reckoning, of rethinking everything we know. And I think that it's not the first. And I think that I'm so glad that you're drawing our eyes to Ken's work and to the work of those others. Look, I think I almost have an allergy at this point to the word stewardship because it is so fraught and so complicated. And If you go back to the Assisi Accords from the 80s, in which I think it was 6 men got up and said what every religion that they spoke for the entire religion said about the world. And it was essentially like, you shouldn't throw your garbage on the ground, and you should like treat the world as a nice place. And in my religion and ecology class that I teach at Stanford, we have bookends. We begin with that, reading the Assisi Accords, which seem really nice until you begin to drill into them and you think, really, that's all religion has, is that it kind of props up this and props up that, and they all really say exactly the same thing. And they all converge. And by the way, that's exactly where many of those large international bodies really are still these days, how all religions converge on certain key points and they don't have any kind of unique voice. And I'm all for inter-religious work together, but I think it needs to be the kind that preserves distinction as opposed to obfuscates it. The end of the class is I ask my students to take a climate change and climate footprint calculator, and then they do it and they base their behavioral changes on the ethical reasoning of our class. And then we talk about the fact that the climate change calculators, those footprints, were created by BP to help diffuse and move move responsibility from the corporate to the individual and all the implications thereof. Where Zionism is now in the 21st century has moved in that direction of not planting the wrong kinds of trees and not draining the wrong swamps and all of these things. But the notion of le'ovda ou le'shomra, let's say that, one way to read that would be pulling in opposite directions, le'ovda in the sense of to develop it, and le'shomra could be in the opposite of preserving. It's clear that we need to be thinking about how to increase the carrying capacity of the planet while also increasing its resilience. And that's a very hard thing, especially in a mode in which development is tied to a certain kind of capitalist ideology and a certain kind of march of progress. And early Zionism wasn't driven by capitalism, but it was certainly driven by a telos of history and a march and a return and a kind of glorification of development and man versus nature, as it were. Although obviously Gordon has so much more to offer than one particular way that he was read. And I think people like Mirsky and Tafat have been working on things exactly like that.
Thank you. David, Professor Shywitz.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Ariel, for not surprisingly a terrific and really thought-provoking talk. And I guess I want to ask a kind of a big picture methodological question, although I think you started to get into it a little bit in your response to Sam's comment. I was struck and of course impressed by some of the parallels or resonances that you identified, especially in the first half of the talk, between some of the Jewish texts and ideas and concepts, and then indigenous teachings. You mentioned some Buddhist and Taoist and other kinds of sort of cross-religious, again, resonances or similarities. But I'm wondering what you do both as a scholar, but also as an activist, right? Or as somebody whose scholarship is aiming at certain kinds of political ends. What you do when those resonances are not there, right? Where you find something unique in the Jewish source base that does not necessarily coincide with or support some of the ideas that are, finding currency in other traditions. This is what Lynn White famously or infamously did with, be fruitful and multiply and conquer the earth, and that sort of counter-ecological in his view, teaching within the Jewish tradition. So I guess, what do you do with those kinds of sources, from a scholarly perspective, in constructing this kind of an ethic, but then also maybe politically or in your activist, goals, when some of the Jewish sources maybe are not, going to further some of those ends?
Okay, thanks. Amazing question. So first of all, I think it requires being honest about the fact that not everything in historical Judaism supports the argument that I'm going to make. And that's a very important methodological point, which is that this is an act of creative reading and not an exclusive reading of Judaism. There's much that I've left by the wayside, and I'm happy to deal with that in the footnotes, as it were. I think that all of our readings of history require not only a capacious lens to be able to include everything, but ways in which we are selective in creating our argument. So I have that honesty. A second is that, at the end of the day, I think that the scientists who say that religion has nothing to offer are wrong. And I think that the homogenization of religion within, like what Lynn White does in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is, obviously a phrase that makes all of us, our skin crawl. I think that that's wrong. I also think that what Braun Taylor and others who talk about deep ecology as something that none of the Abrahamic traditions or none of the world religions can really stick, but it needs to be a religion that is more rooted in nature as opposed to the abstractions of these traditions. I also think that there's something there which is a kind of myopia as well. There is tremendous resource within these traditions. And I don't think I'm brushing them against the grain, but I am being, I would say, selective in my archaeology. I think that that's kind of the nature of a constructive project. On the question of other religions and on sort of our own relationship there too, here's what I would say. I have no pretense that Judaism has all the answers. I actually probably wouldn't have seen any of these things if I hadn't been reading broadly in the environmental philosophy, in environmental humanities, in indigenous philosophy, in other religious traditions. And here I'm actually really grateful to be at a university where no one understands what I do. And I have to be able to talk to people who exist in totally different fields, who can't read Hebrew, but I start talking about it and they're like, oh yeah, you should read this book and you should read this book. And all of a sudden I realize that there are things in the tradition that are kind of hidden in plain sight. And it's not, I would say, brushing the tradition against the grain. That's not really my style, but it's looking at other ways to play the score, looking at other ways to set those texts to music. And I think that's the kind of work that I'm interested in. On the other hand, I do think that these kind of intergalactic climate accords have real potential when people say, this is what my tradition brings to the table, and this is what the international sphere or the national sphere or the local sphere has to learn from it. When Jews and Muslims can get together and talk about the purpose of halakha, of al-sharia, in terms of thinking about obligation, and when Christians can talk about a kind of messianic virtue ethic and a high Christology in which the world reverberates with this kind of divine purpose, there is something really powerful about those isolated voices, which maybe we do have in our tradition, maybe we don't, but it's certainly in a minor key compared to the major key that they're putting forward. And each one of us, I think, in our distinctive ways has something to add. So we learn from those other traditions, and we find what we have in our tradition. We have something to add, so hopefully they can also see new things. And together, the kind of, whether we call it a salad bowl or a melting pot or a mosaic or however we want to talk about this kind of, I don't know, maybe it's just because I've spent too much time on Zoom, the kind of Jamboard, bulletin board of different ideas. I think that the world would be a much richer and much deeper place if, like the Ketoret, we have all of these different ways of thinking that come together, and then none of them in isolation have that power, but together they can create something different. And that's the kind of reservoir of the how do we get out of the fly bottle, the fly trap that we're currently in. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I had a lot of things to say, but whenever I had some thinker, I thought, so you related it by yourself. So I wanted to say the first thing that I wanted to emphasize that the importance of going to halakha and not just to midrash, that was very central in your in what you said about responsibility. And I think that this is a very important direction that the research about religion and ecological, like it's really unique in this direction. And also what you said about Robert Cover, I thought it was very important. And I wondered if you know about any any opportunities or any rabbanim that write that think in this direction, and any current rabbanim achshaviyim, like currency rabbanim that do it. And another thing I wanted to say is about Zelda. That I think you said about in אני אוהבת את כל העצים שווה, that I think that this is the best sentence in the world. And I wanted also to say it about רצון שיכור מסוכסך, that I think that it is a very important poem in this subject, and also the concept of Shabbat in her poetry. I think it is very important, and in a very interesting way, very similar to the concept of Heschel about the Shabbat. And I don't know if she knew him. He wasn't translated in these years to Hebrew, but somehow they developed very similar thought about this. So this is also I wanted to add.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
There's a whole book waiting to be written about Zelda on this particular topic, but exactly, the miraculous ordinary. Shabbat, as you said, I don't think she had any contact with Heschel. Heschel's beauty of his declaration of the Sabbath is both a kind of rebuke of technological advancement, but also, it's a kind of post-Holocaust meditation. It's a lot of things. It's a beautiful book. It also, it does what Heschel always does, which is it extrapolates from his own religious experience as if it is true for all people and in all times. And one of the things that I love so much about Zelda's poetry, my wife and Adina and I, we talk about this all the time, is that Zelda has no such pretensions. She writes about her own experience, and she writes from the heart of what she saw when she is mevarechet ala nerot, and when she does this in her own world, and it's so compelling and it's so powerful, precisely for all those reasons. So fantastic. Yeah, it's a really important addendum. And in terms of halacha, I mean, the idea that religion can make claims of you in America is a complicated one, and the idea that religion can make claims on one's actions is very complicated, because that tends to be floated in America only regarding certain things, in which only certain things and only for certain people can religion control their actions, and usually it's other people. And it's really hard to convince scientists that religion is important, because it actually makes normative demands and it structures your life in entirely different ways. And there's no cognate for that in so many ways for many, many scientists and for many, many Americans. But I think it is indeed, as you said, I think it's one of the great contributions, because Judaism's ethic is born out in action. And the sort of idea of an ideal halacha is how we put our values into action, and every action that we take is a kind of theological statement. And every kind of theological statement is a kind of psak halacha, and every kind of psak halacha is a theological statement about the kind of world that God wants us to create. I think it's a totally different way of thinking about halacha, unfortunately, than those who think with legal positivist mentalities or other kinds have kind of gotten stuck. And in terms of the number of people who are dealing with it these days, I've been fighting an uphill battle for a decade now, trying to get people thinking about this. Even the places where you think this would be happening, Hartman, for example, in Israel, it's only the very beginning of that. Hartman in America is barely thinking about it. Rav Sherlow, I think, is the closest. I think he's taking this very seriously. What's his name? He's Tzemach Yore has written an article about, it was actually in that issue of Worldviews that you contributed to also, about why rabbis don't take this seriously. And it was kind of diagnostic rather than hopeful about why people don't take it seriously. But I think that, serious misunderstandings about halacha contribute to that. And also the fact that, the idea that Jewish history is history, but more so. We have the same experience as everyone else, but even more so, the epistemic opacity that the world has, we also have. And the refusal of halacha to take on this issue, to me, is the great moral failing of those who take halacha seriously, to say that it has nothing to say to the greatest moral and ethical moment of our time.
I have a question. So
Please.
if we're talking about halakha, what do you think should be done? Do we need to think about a prayer for the world, for the sake of the world, or should we think about banning meat? You know, not eating meat altogether. What kind of halakha are you envisioning in light of climate change?
So, one of the first things we learned together was was Masachet Ta'anit at Hartman, and I think that's what everyone should be reading now. Like, that's what we should be doing. Yeah, so for sure, climate tshuva and these kind of acts, we should bring in the Aron into the center of the square and talking about the fact that we are literally in droughts here, there, everywhere, but also the world that is all around us. And the whole point of those is that, okay, there's a magical dimension. I get it. Late antiquity, everyone's doing magic. But the line between magic and theology and ethical transformation, as we know from the interpreters of those sources, is a very complicated one. And I think that those are things that need to be pulled to the forefront. I'm definitely not for a kind of, let's use a crass term, theocracy in which everyone has to follow halakha. I do think that halakha, to those who take it seriously, needs to be able to say whether or not meat in the contemporary moment, is there any possibility of a kind of heter for meat? It also, I think, should make demands of us in terms of how we get on airplanes, how we invest in mutual funds, how we think about the systems to which we contribute, and whether or not those are, in fact, permissible. Amitav Ghosh has a couple of pages about academia in his new book, The Nutmeg's Curse, about the high carbon cost of those of us who are involved in academia, which is often hidden. And I think that's key. He also has an entire set of chapters about defense and about the way in which that would factor in. But my point about halakha is that A, for those who take halakha seriously, it needs to be reshaped in light of these values and in light of this real world situation. And B, whether or not one takes halakha seriously as a force that guides their own life, halakha as a system of values set into normative, prescriptive obligations that, as I understand them, encourage us toward networks of reciprocity, obligation, and shared commitment, that should be a voice that is brought to the table when people are having policy discussions in American legal moments. So in another lifetime, in another world, I wrote something about policy, privacy policy, and halakha, because in America, I think it's complicated in Israel in different ways. America has only two things that they base privacy on. One is anonymity, and the other is waiver and consent, which we all know are total fictions. So it turns out Judaism is a totally different way of thinking about privacy, which is not just rights-based and not just obligations-based, but talks about privacy of the individual within a society. What if people who are making actual legislative decisions got to think about things in these ways? So here, this is why I write in English. I write in English and then I translate things into Hebrew, because that's also part of the argument that I want to be making, is that those who are driving this bus, as it were, ought to be bothered by voices of dissent that do not agree, and they also ought to have a much bigger toolbox than what they've been handed by a very particular reading of the Western philosophical and economic tradition.
Daniela, do you want to say something?
Yeah, but I think someone else had his hand up. Or am I wrong? Datami, did you want to know? I just wanted to say that it seems so far-fetched from the Israeli realities, thinking of the last elections and, the representatives of the religious voice in Israeli society rejoicing for the reversion, rejoicing at the perspective of the reversion of the sort of ban, or not exactly ban, but limiting plastic.
Bring them back.
Yes, it became like a symbol of the repression of the progressive voice against, and I can understand why, thinking of families of 16 nefashot, using chad pa'ami makes a lot of sense. So we're so far from like I think the Israeli public that identifies with halakha and with religion and with religious leadership is miles away from your vision. And I wonder if, and I think it's not going in that direction. I mean, it's going in the opposite direction. So I wonder how applicable this is, and though I find it inspirational, I wonder whether it's a voice that can resonate in our society here.
The whole world, not just in Israel, the Israeli elections were mirrored by so many different moments all over the world in the past few years. The whole world feels like it's going in that direction, which is kind of mind-boggling, and it's really hard to watch. On the other hand, things like this feel impossible until they're not. The Haredi society in which they exist in a kind of mitziyut chilufit feels so solid until it's not. And I think one of the benefits of the longue durée of history is that things that feel like they are impossible to get beyond, whether it's modes of thinking or whether it's modes of action, they don't remain set in stone forever. And I think here, thinking of this mode of thinking and the work that I assume everyone on this call, even though I don't always know about it, is working for, is kind of like, Krista Tippett had a description of this recently in a podcast about social activism as yeast, where you set things into motion and you allow it to rise on the long scale, but it's not always immediate. Sometimes it takes 2 hours for something to prove, and sometimes it takes 2 decades for something to mature, and sometimes it takes 2 centuries for something to come. But we creating a kind of new post-enlightenment Chokhmah Israel that takes seriously the fears of the moment and everything from emancipation to the Holocaust to our contemporary moment around the environment. There is a revolution. It's just one that takes a long time. And while the contemporary community, whether it's in Israel or whether it's in Long Island, who takes halakha seriously, doesn't see things in these ways, I am both not particularly optimistic about the way in which they will radically change their behavior once they read something that I wrote and it wrote it in Hebrew so they actually can sort of deal with it. I don't think it's going to change there. On the other hand, I think that long-term cultural shifts do happen, and that's what we need to be fighting for. And they do happen. Judaism as it is now is not what it was, and it's not what it will be, and it's not what it has to be.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Mayse. Any last questions before we wrap things up? Okay, so in that case, I'll just first of all thank you very much, Professor Mayse, for speaking with us and sharing your thoughts. It was really stimulating and inspiring. I'll also at this juncture mention that our next seminar in 2 weeks on campus in Beersheva is with Professor Elchanan Reiner, who's going to be speaking about the cult of the holy place in the late antiquity in medieval Galilee. That will be in Hebrew in Beersheva. And in 4 weeks from now, on December 13th, we'll be meeting again on Zoom with Professor Nicholas Paul from Fordham to hear about gardens in the landscape of the Latin East. So thank you very much for everyone who joined us.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks very much.
Please follow up with me by email. I know, Peter, I can see there's already something. Please follow up with me by email. Tell me things that I need to read or things that I need to think through. I'm so grateful for your engagement. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Thank you.